because I drive a lot around the state, and I got stuck for an incredibly long time after we left Cambridge, and I was so worried I wasn't going to get a chance to see all of you tonight, and we did it, yay. So yay!
I need the mic.
Very sensitive.
Yeah.
Not.
All right. My name is Bob Massie.
The first thing I want to say is that Indivisible is one of the most important organizations in the country, maybe in the country's history, because you are doing exactly what we need to do to take back this government and to take back this country. And I want to thank you. I have spoken to some Indivisible groups all around the state, and the fire, the passion, the determination, the hard work is essential. And one of my favorite moments since the election of Donald Trump was watching the Indivisible group in Arkansas take Senator Tom Cotton apart piece by piece. One of the most odious senators in the United States Senate. And he got up in front of 2,000 of his own constituents in a huge high school. Some of you may have seen this YouTube, and for an hour and a half, 2 hours, they told him what they really thought about the attempt to destroy the ACA, and he was shocked, and he went back and said, you know, if we keep going against the ACA, we might lose Congress, and that was exactly the message that needed to be sent. Unfortunately, I haven't totally heard it yet, but it needed to be sent, and it was sent by people like you. So that's my first thing, is thank you. So this is a little different. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, but then what I'd like to do is really have a conversation with you, because one of the pleasures of running for governor of Massachusetts is that you start to get to know Massachusetts very well. And I have been now in almost 120 communities. I've spoken, I keep track, spreadsheets are wonderful, and I keep track of approximately how many people I speak, and it's almost 8,000 people in smaller groups like this. And it's not just that I get to talk to you, but that I get to listen, and I have, where did I put it? Oh, here it is, my notebook in which I put the things that I learn. So I am a lifelong social justice and environmental activist and advocate. And that partly comes from the experience that Allison talked about. When I was born with this serious genetic illness called hemophilia, which causes bleeding not so much from cuts, but in your joints. And you get a bleeding in the joint, it comes up quickly, it goes back slowly, and so over time that joint is damaged. And so by the time I was 4, I had lost the ability to walk. I had leg braces, I had a wheelchair, and what I learned at that very early age is that as human beings we are naturally frightened of people who are different. It's not a happy trait, it's very deeply grounded in us. But I would walk into a room of other children and they would react with fear before I'd open my mouth. And even their parents would react with fear because they didn't know what was going to happen to me. So I'd say, or a friend would say, can Bobby come over? And mother would say, yeah, well, you know, we're not quite sure what might happen if he came over, so maybe next week. And next week never came. So that experience of being rejected before I even opened my mouth was formative for me, because I quickly realized that I was not the only person who experienced that in the world. And the recognition that so many people get rejected and are excluded, and excluded by our emotions and gradually by our systems, that turned me into the kind of activist that I became, because I realized that fundamentally justice is about inclusion, it is about bringing people together, it's about overcoming those fears. And ultimately, I think that's what this country is about inclusion and justice, liberty and justice for all. And that's exactly what's being threatened right now. This period is one of the most dangerous in the history of the United States. The Republic itself is being challenged, not just by this president who swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution that he's never read, doesn't understand, and is actively undermining. But it's not just him. It's all the people who are being given permission by him to destroy our rights, step by step. Right to free speech, assembly, all of those things are under attack. And we have to fight back, and that's why it's so great that you're here and that have pulled together. So coming back to my own story, by the time I got to high school and college, I was by then a seasoned activist, and I worked very hard on women's rights. I went to a college that had all-male eating clubs, and I tried to get rid of those. 38 years later, they're now gone. It took a little time, but they're gone. I worked on labor rights. I worked on the South African anti-apartheid struggle. That became a very important part of my life. After I finished college, I went to divinity school, as you heard. I thought I was going straight to law school and into politics, but this was just at the end of the Watergate days, and I thought, I need to think more deeply about why we're here and what we care about. And I chose to do that through theology and philosophy. And I took a year off and worked for Ralph Nader on corporate accountability, and I came back and I finished that when it was ordained, went into the church, opened a homeless shelter in New York City. But I was burning to understand what are the real forces of money, economics, investment, finance that drive our economy and turn us into an unjust society, even though we won't want to be a fair society. So my parents had just adjusted to the notion that I was gone to divinity school and was ordained. They're like, okay, we finally know what Bobby's doing. And then I announced that I was going to Harvard Business School. And that was a bit of a shock, but I explained to them, no, I'm going because I want to understand all these systems. What I was really trying to do, before we had a name for it, is study sustainability. Sustainability, which is the integration of creating wealth, but doing it in a manner that's fair, creates prosperity for everyone, and does it in a manner that strengthens ecological systems and doesn't destroy them. So I showed up in the fall of 1984, which those of you may remember with a certain chill in your heart, was the re-election of Ronald Reagan. There was a time when the markets could do no wrong, and here I am, this super earnest, super activist minister in the first year at Harvard Business School. And that was quite an experience. But I'll tell you, I learned a lot of good things about how business works, markets work, how to create prosperity and jobs and investment, and all of that in some ways was demythologized and deconstructed, and so I understand that a lot better. And I also learned how damaging big multinational companies can really be when they're left without any government controls, when they operate purely on the basis of what they believe is their goal, to maximize shareholder wealth. And so anyway, I wrote a dissertation on South Africa. I became a professor. I wrote a long book on South Africa. If you really want to know the history of the divestment movement and how divestment worked, I wrote an 800-page book on that, so you know what you're doing for the next 3 years. It's also very heavy, so it functions as an exercise device if you wish to do that. I'm very proud to have written that book because the conclusion of that book, after all 800 pages, was, in spite of what everyone said during that long debate, everyone said, what you do doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you go out and march around. It doesn't matter if you sell your stock. It doesn't matter if you write your letter. You're just one little person. And that's the message that we always hear from the powerful. It doesn't matter. Why are you even trying? Well, I think I demonstrate incontrovertibly that it was the accumulation of so many millions of people inside South Africa and outside South Africa that led to the end of that brutally cruel, unfair, disgusting regime, racist regime of apartheid. And to me, that story has given me great strength as we move forward, because that looked pretty bleak for many, many years. It was getting worse. It was becoming mechanized. It was becoming more brutal. It was supported by more countries, by more corporations, and there was so much death and destruction. And yet, they came through that, and they came through it, and it was actually in 1993 when they were writing their new constitution that I went to South Africa as a Fulbright professor, and I was working on this long book, and I saw And it was an unforgettable sight. I saw this country which had been through brutality, cruelty, death. People finally decided we can't keep going. We have to use democracy to rebuild who we are, to redefine who we are. And so people whose family members had killed each other are in rooms days on end discussing, well, what do we want to live for? What do we want to build? And I found that so powerful. It's like reading the Federalist Papers. Every day you'd open the paper. What's the role of the Supreme Court? They called it the Constitution. What's the role of this? What are the rights of the minority going to be? All these issues that for us that used to until now seem far away and abstract and settled, for them were vibrant, urgent questions of democracy. And I came back to Massachusetts, the birthplace of democracy, modern democracy. And what were we talking about in '94? Does anyone remember? Crime, welfare, and taxes, which are three ways, really, of bashing the poor. And I thought, that's not the democracy I want to have. That's not the topics I want to work on. It's not the things that I think we should be concerned about. And so I did one of the many more foolish things, at the beginning anyway, which is I decided to run for lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. Now, I had no secret trust fund, I had no name recognition, I had no political experience, but I could sense that people were ready for a different kind of voice. And it turned out that I was right, at least up to a point, because I won the Democratic nomination and I was the nominee. And then we got blown out of the water by Bill Weld, who outspent us 25-1. But I learned how important it is for people to go out and talk about what they believe in, because not everyone knows how to bring to the surface the words that are inside their hearts. So to have a politics that states clearly, what do we dream for? What do we want to work for? What do we want to believe in? That's very, very important. And when people forget to do that, those values die. And so again, that's why what you're doing is so important. Now let me just talk a little bit about those underlying values. As I've been in this race, I have particularly been drawn back to the story of and the values of Franklin Roosevelt. And I thought I knew a lot about Franklin Roosevelt, but he was even more extraordinary. And one of the things that he did in 1944, when the United States was still at war, is that he gave a speech in which he talked about what America should live by, what our values should be, what our goals should be after the war. Now, the war's still going on. He's been through the Depression. He's been through World War II. But he's already thinking, what's the world we want to build? What's the country we want to build? And what he said in this State of the Union speech was, we have come a long way with our political rights, but now we need to articulate our economic rights. 1944. Because if we do not have certain basic building blocks in life, we are not free. Very interesting argument. We talk about having these rights to core elements, a good home, a good school, a good doctor, a good job. We still talk about those. But we don't root them in the idea of freedom. And yet when you think about it, because Republicans have tried to walk off with freedom. That's ours. You're not allowed to talk about it. Well, we do want to talk about it, because unless we have these basics, good home, good school, good doctor, good job, clean environment, enough to eat, unless you have those basics, you are not free. We are not free. Our fellow citizens are not free. And that's the kind of values that we have been defending, and that's the values that are under attack. So, I mentioned I was in South Africa. I came back, I ran for office, and then I started running organizations that bring different groups together. Environmental groups, human rights groups, big investors. There's a lot of power in the capital markets and the pension funds and the institutional investors who actually own most of the big corporations in the country. They don't usually exercise that power, but I realized, and other people realized, that you could make deep change if you brought those huge forces to bear on companies. And so I ran a group called CERES, an environmental alliance with pension funds. And I'll tell you something, when a company looks out the door and they see an environmentalist walking, they go, oh, we're going to close that door now. And then when they see the environmentalist walking hand in hand with somebody who owns 120 million shares, they say, oh, sorry, we didn't see who you were with. Come right in. What would you like for tea? And so we use that power, and it's power, to sit down with these companies and say, here's what we want to know. What are your plans on biodiversity, climate change, energy, water use, labor rights, human rights? Some of them told us to get lost. Others were willing to make change. If they didn't like what we had to say, we raised it at their annual meeting, and we raised it over and over and over until we got the change we wanted. And then I started a bunch of other organizations that have had a large national or international impact. One sets up a system whereby companies have to measure and disclose their impact on human rights, labor rights, the environment, climate, and so forth. That never happened before. That system of sustainability accounting is now dominant around the world, except in the US, you're not surprised. But all over the world, this global reporting initiative is now working. And another thing was that I realized, I first started working on climate in 1992, that this was likely to have an impact on our communities, on our economy, on our investments. And so I asked these big pension funds, have you thought through what you're investing in? Do you really want to be in that coal, which is dirty and going away, or fossil fuels, or all the other things that can be transformed by climate? And I'll tell you, I was laughed at the beginning a couple of times. Today, that group, the Investor Network on Climate Risk, comes together every 2 years. And the last time, always at the UN, and the last time we had institutions, investors, banks, and others talking about how to transition from fossil fuel to clean energy. And they controlled assets worth $22 trillion, which is bigger than the whole GDP of the United States. So I'm raising these examples because they're examples of deep structural change. Now, have we solved all the problems of capitalism? No. But these are deep structural changes as to how the economy works that were made possible because I and others thought through how can we change this system so that it moves away from its destructive influences and to become a positive force. And I did that without having the authority or the convening power or the recognition of being a governor. I was a guy who ran a nonprofit, but who was able to persuade people to come together and to get over their differences and to stop fighting about stupid things and to learn from each other and to hear each other and to respect each other and then to work together. And that's what I think we need in this country, not the kind of horrific behavior we're getting in Congress. I mean, the sad thing, and I know you all feel this, is you read the paper every day and you think, how low can they go? And the answer is lower than what you thought. And the next day it's worse, and the next day it's worse. But again, that's why this is a moment of such critical importance for the country. Now, I'll go back to my medical story briefly. So all along, dealing with this hemophilia, but I also was exposed to HIV, as Allison mentioned. And when I found out about that, which wasn't until 1984, but actually contracted it in 1978, it really was a death sentence because people who had HIV in 1984 lived on average 2 years after they were diagnosed. And it was a very scary, ugly time in America because America was struggling with whether to pull on the best side of our nature or the worst. There was a serious proposal to take everybody with HIV and put them in quarantine on an island off the coast of North Carolina. That was a serious proposal. And another proposal was that everyone with HIV should be tattooed because they were in danger and everyone needed to be warned. One of the people who said this was the writer William F. Buckley. Some of you will remember. My father had actually gone to college with him. My father was a scholarship student from Tennessee, and they both became writers. And Buckley put this in the paper, sort of as a joke, but not. My father responded with a public letter saying, next time you say this, I'm going to come to New York and tattoo you myself. So I knew my father loved me, but it was a very grim time. But we didn't go down that road in the end. It's true that a family with hemophilia, with a boy with hemophilia, they burned their house to the ground in Florida out of fear. Other things like that happened, and of course, hundreds of thousands of people died, millions of people died. Most people with hemophilia my age are dead because of HIV. Why didn't I die? Nobody really knew. And finally I went to the doctors and said, I've had HIV now for 16 years. Why am I still here? And they said, that's a really good question. Why don't we look into that? And it turned out, after, I'm shortening the story a little bit, I had a genetic resistance to HIV. So suddenly, having thought my life was going to be short, that had really limited my retirement planning, I want to tell you, I was going to be fine. And then a few years after that, I discovered that I had this great resistance to HIV, but not to hepatitis C. That was destroying my liver. I had to quit all those great jobs and international projects and just go home. And so I was back in the same desert that I was in when I was a boy, although this time I had the internet. And I also had a mission, which was, first of all, to learn to bake, because I'm a terrible baker. And I figured this time I'm going to figure out how to make a pie. So I can make a pie, but I'm still a terrible baker. And I read a biography of every president in the United States and a whole lot of other people, Susan B. Anthony, Alexander Hamilton, because I really wanted to understand, how does change come in a democracy like this? How does a democracy like this respond to crisis? So if you want to spend the rest of the evening talking about Millard Fillmore or John Tyler or the other Chester Arthur, all the people that, we've forgotten you were president, I can do that. Susan B. Anthony, who is my hero, an amazing, amazing American leader that we don't talk about enough. And then finally, I got a liver transplant after waiting for 7 years, and it cured the cirrhosis, it cured the hepatitis, and it cured the original hemophilia. So, here I am. I'm 61. I'm in the best health I've ever been. I'm burning with passion to fight off this monstrosity that has come over the country and to go back to making the progress that we know we need to make to a just, sustainable, prosperous world with liberty and justice for all. That's what I believe in. It's what I fought for, and it's what Massachusetts could be leading on if we had different leadership. Now, we can talk about all the different specifics, but let me just make a general point. I've been all over this state, and the problems that people are feeling are deep and real. And what people are feeling, and I'd love to hear your versions of this, but is that the promise they thought they had, which is if they worked hard, they would be able to move forward in their lives and their children would be able to move even farther than that, is breaking down. Good home, too expensive. Good school, too expensive. Good doctor, maybe. Good job, probably not. I mean, you can get a job, but it's going to be at $11 an hour with no benefits and a schedule determined by somebody else, with no career, with no future. That's much of what the economy is around Massachusetts, not maybe in Boston, in some parts of Boston. And the problem is the people in Boston don't know what's going on in the rest of the state. So much of this state is invisible to the elites in government, the elites in the legislature, the elites in business. Now, there are some very good people. I've met with some wonderful senators, some people who are working hard, but they are being blocked in what they want to do. So everywhere around the state, people want modern transportation where you can get from one part of the state to the other, as it exists all over the world in industrialized countries. They want to move to renewable energy. We are spending $18 billion a year importing fossil fuel that we don't need, driven by a system of utilities that are preserving their fossil fuel rather than moving. We have slowed down wind. We have slowed down solar. We need, obviously, to make it possible for more people to go to get a higher education. I was at UMass Boston before I came here. People working one job, two jobs, trying to get that bachelor's, taking 6 years to do it, and ending up still with $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $80,000 worth of debt, which means that they're going to carry that debt around for the rest of their lives. So we're taking our own young people and our future workforce, and we're telling them, hey, here's this prison of debt. We invite you to get in it because you're never going to get out of it. And I met people who, a young woman who wanted to get her graduate degree so she could teach, and she got halfway through, and then she had health problems, family problems, so she could not complete that master's, so now she has the $60,000 of debt, but not the degree. And that story gets told over and over again. Now, to address those problems, transportation or affordable housing or renewable energy, you need a long-term plan, and that's exactly what this governor does not have. So I'm going to wrap up now because I know I want to hear from you. I want to answer any questions you might have. But a lot is at stake. A lot is at stake, ranging from the defense of the republic itself to the future of our children or ourselves for the whole state. Because if we don't make a change in this election, we're going to keep going for 4 more years of doing nothing, for 8 more years of doing nothing, and then we're going to be even more stuck. I mean, this traffic I was in tonight, and then the last few nights, I just want to tell you, that's not getting any better on its own. I had to go out to Central Mass. I went 42 miles, took me an hour and 45 minutes. I had to go down to a TV show in Taunton, 44 miles, an hour and 50 minutes. And to get here just took me about an hour and 20 minutes or an hour and 30 minutes from Cambridge. That's going to get worse. And if we don't have a transportation system coming along behind to replace what we've got, we're just going to spend our whole lives sitting in cars, waving at each other. And you can just take that out across the entire Commonwealth. And yet, if we made these changes, we would not only fight back against Trump, we would set up an example of what Massachusetts has always been, which is a leader in the country and a leader, therefore, in the world. And we are not leading right now. So just to wrap up, one of the reasons, after reading about all these presidents and reading about American tradition and reading about the values that we should be proud of, even though we've often fallen short of them, one of the things that has really moved me is that I'm running for governor in the same state that Jack Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy were from. And the reason that that's so important, and the reason I think we still believe in the Kennedys, is because they had a somewhat different view of politics. They didn't say, hey, make a list of all the stuff you want and I'll get that for you. Please vote for me. What they said is, as Americans, we have special opportunities and special responsibilities. And we take on great projects because that's what made us into this country, and that's what defines us as a country. So you may remember that Jack Kennedy said, we go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And Bobby Kennedy used to say, quoting George Bernard Shaw, he used to say, some people see things the way they are and ask why. I see things that have never been and ask, why not? Why not? And then Teddy, not long before he died, said, we do great things because we are Americans. We scale the heights. We reach the moon. I know it. I've seen it. I've lived it. And then the most important point, he said, and we can do it again. So that's the spirit I think we should be living by in Massachusetts. Not, we can't, it's too expensive, we won't, it's not worth it, doesn't matter, these people are invisible, why do we care, we're doing fine, and all the excuses we have for going nowhere and then watching as our systems crumble and as people are betrayed and as people are broken and left behind. That's not who we are. We are the people who believe in one Commonwealth, who work together, and who understand that our prosperity comes from each other, and who are willing to articulate not just where we are, but where we want to go, and then to go there together. That's the spirit that I would bring, along with all of you, if I become governor. And I'll tell you, it can be a little scary because I know my flaws. I promise you, I am a long way from perfect. But I think this is a moment when this kind of voice is needed, not just from me, but from all of you. Now, you've already concluded that. You've reached that conclusion. That's why you're here. But I want to tell you to be of good cheer, because one thing that people forget, oh, Charlie Baker's got a lot of money. He's a very popular guy. He's very tall. He's a lot taller than me. But whoever becomes the Democratic nominee for governor is going to join in a coordinated campaign with Elizabeth Warren's re-election campaign. And she raised $45 million last time. And her position is under attack from the right. And what that's going to mean is that those of us who support her are going to walk through walls to make sure that she remains in that seat, and that's going to push turnout up. And when turnout goes up, Democrats win, which means that the Democratic nominee for governor could become the next governor. No matter what Charlie Baker's trying to perform a Jedi mind trick on you. Don't even try. This is not the race you are looking for. We know differently. We can take back this office, we can put the state back, we can defend the republic, and we can finally go back to building the democracy, the economy that we deserve and that we can achieve. Thank you.